Hi everyone, my name is Sarah and I'm your group facilitator for this week. Together we will analyze Conroy's piece titled Globalization, Educational Change, and the National State. What I want everybody to understand from the beginning is that Conroy is presenting a debate in which he's asking the fundamental question, which is, does globalization harm or help our educational system? So in this case, you will see how he's presenting both sides of the argument. So I want everybody to understand from the beginning that Conroy uses the term globalization as an umbrella term as he discusses the different aspects of globalization. What I want to explain from the beginning is that the context has changed. School districts, our political and social environment are not the only factors that shape our educational policy. There are new forces that affect the policies and the political dynamic. Now, what Conroy is examining are two factors: globalization and ICT, and how they play a role in education. So what we need to understand from the article is that globalization has a main outcome, and this is to create certain kinds of skills in which, such as language, mathematical reasoning, scientific logic, and programming. And so in this case, creating these certain kind of skill, there exists an increase of competition among highly skilled labor. Now, what do I mean by competition? Here's how there is a competition. Unfortunately, due to the competition for highly skilled labor, there is now an increase in the rate of return for university education, and this obviously translates into more and more spending on primary education from people who are higher on the social economic standard ladder. So what does this mean? This means that globalization has inputted more competition on educational resources. And therefore, this is what Conroy is trying to explain, forming stratified schooling. So competition has now formed stratified schooling. There is now a hierarchy. So let me give you examples in order to reinforce how schooling has become stratified. A great example are extracurricular events. And so usually these extracurricular events such as trips or talent shows or art shows, they need fundraising. And they need money from the neighborhood or from parents or from outside sources other than the board. And unfortunately, there are some neighborhoods which it is difficult for them to afford to fundraise for these activities. So these resources are not accessible to some neighborhoods, while in other cases they are accessible to other neighborhoods. Now, on a second note, tutoring is another great example about how there is stratification in schooling. Some people cannot afford private tutoring, and therefore the resource is So I limited. want to present an article written by Robin Doolittle from the Toronto Star, which is a great example that illustrates how the increase in globalization affects the increase in competition, and therefore it results in an increase of priority neighborhoods. Now, priority neighborhoods are assessed on the basis of rate of diabetes, voter turnout, household income, and so she kind of looks at a timeline in which between 2011 all the way to 2017, which basically examines the increase in the priority neighborhoods here in Toronto. So before they went from 11, then it increased to 22. Now there are 31 priority neighborhoods here in Toronto. So it is evident that geographical location determines basically the likelihood of going to university or having a higher rate of going back to school. So I don't want to sound too negative. I also want to point out the positive aspects of globalization. And so Conroy basically says good aspects of globalization is that it's helped the developing world increase the demand for middle-skilled labor. It has increased the rate of return for women into the workforce. So we now understand the importance of women in the workplace. It has also allowed for a greater circulation of labor generally, which means that there is an increase now in multiculturalization in societies, and there's an increased emphasis for teaching science and math. On a last point, globalization has allowed international organizations like World Bank to examine education as a form of a commodity. What do I mean by this? I mean that they're using standardized test scores as one of the indicators for economic prosperity. So depending on the education, we can look at it as a tool or a resource for economic prosperity in countries. But I need to point out something very crucial about this indicator for economic prosperity. So we need to take into account that with economic prosperity, there is a bigger argument, which we've discussed in class on our discussion forums a couple of times, the tension between local and the global context. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean that every country has its own educational process, okay? The use of resources and educational processes itself is very different depending on the local context. So a great example would be a multi-age one-room school in Africa will have a very different everything regarding educational resources. But that doesn't mean that the educational system itself is at fault. What we have to understand is that some situations will never attain the global goal because it all depends on the local context. And so this is what Conroy is saying on page 8. He's saying success of any educational policy depends on the national, state, economic, and social policies. So this means that educational policies are determined by the national state. It is the state which provides the essential resources and establishes policies. So I want to continue by moving on to talking about globalization and the role of educational technology in reform. So the author is presenting another debate with respect to how globalization plays a role in technology, specifically when we are talking about ICT. So again, we're going to go back and forth in the debate again, and we'll in this aspect, on a positive note, globalization has affected education in 3 ways with regards to ICT. It's provided computers in classrooms. It has increased the use of measuring performance. So this allows for principals to see how the teachers are doing in the classroom, and also allow teachers to see how the students and how they are learning. So there's a lot of data right now that's accessible and readily available because of ICT. But again, here's the problem, that there is a negative aspect for globalization and the role of educational technology. Because of globalization and ICT, there has been something called a digital divide, which basically says the following. People are not everybody's getting the right resources, or some people are not getting the resources at all. So even though ICT has become very portable and very accessible, there are differences in access in different income groups. And so it is very evident that the digital divide exists in a number of ways. There are neighborhoods, for instance, in which children or students from lower income families do not have this access to ICT. So they have less access, and the schools that they attend have less resources. That's a first note. On a second note, even if the schools have ICT hardware and software, the digital divide does still exist because unfortunately, ICT skills are not being taught by well-equipped teachers. So these teachers that come in to teach ICT are not qualified to teach. So I kind of want to conclude on this note so that everybody understands what Carnoy is trying to present. The use of ICT application in schools has no effect, on enhancing students' ICT skills in the global economy. However, ICT applications through the computer-assisted instructions was crucial in enhancing the students' performance test scores in international test scores. But the problem lies in not having qualified teachers to teach ICT skills. So this is the main problem that arises. Now, last but not least, Carnoy is presenting another question or another aspect of globalization. So he discusses how does globalization diminish the role of the national state in the education environment? And so again, we're going to be presenting yes and no. Yes, it does diminish the role of the state, the power of the state, because with increased global income competitiveness, this makes the state focus on policies that are supposed to improve global competitiveness at the expense of policies that stabilize domestic income. So in this case, education is at risk, and this diminishment of the state can either go both ways. You can either have a state that can follow the policies and form social cohesion, or you can have a state which forms social chaos. A great example, I want to reinforce what social chaos is so that everybody understands how the role of the state is diminished by globalization. In Egypt, about a couple of months ago, in November actually, in order to compete globally, they were told by lending agencies to float their currency, which is the Egyptian pound. Now, unfortunately, when they floated their Egyptian pound, it has reduced its value by 50% against the dollar. So, as you can see, in this case, because of globalization and because of how the lending agencies, in this case, in Egypt's case, it was the International Monetary Fund, required them to do something that implicates their economy. So basically what the lending agency said was, would you like to compete globally? Okay, we have some prerequisites that you must do in order to compete globally. So they implement the rules, they call the shots. Now, on a side note, there are also situations where no, globalization does not diminish the power of the state, because we need to understand that the national state is what creates an applicable environment for global competitiveness, okay? It is the state that calls the shots. They're the ones who do business. They're the ones who knows how the state will thrive or deteriorate. So it is the responsibility of the state to make individuals' social lives and organizations. Now, another example of why the globalization does not affect the national state is because of social capital and the basic needs that the state must meet in order to allow for people to live. So what we need to understand is that the national state's entities, it is the state that basically creates the political environment for a global market to thrive, meaning without the national state, you cannot function on a global level. So it is the national state's responsibility. So I want to sum up what Carnoy is basically trying to say, because it is a lot to take in, especially that he is going back and forth between globalization and how it harms us and globalization and how it helps us. So what I want to point out is that we are living in a vicious circle. That is the truth. And so the state must compete on a global level, okay? So in order for it to compete on a global level, it is forced to put constraints on the size of public spending, like free education or better quality education. So, I mean, the national state is in the middle. It wants to be able to compete globally, but in order to compete globally, it needs to follow certain conditions that are imposed by the international organization, what we saw in the example for Egypt. So here is the dilemma that I want everybody to really understand, is that in order to compete globally, because this is the truth, the state must improve their educational system. But in order to solve this dilemma, and so that in order to finance for the high quality education, there must be a shift in to the private sector. So that's the inconvenient truth. That, however, what I want everybody to understand is that this is weakening the national state. And it is creating a stratified state, because equity is disappearing in our societies, and more education, instead of being a right, it has become a privilege. So I want everybody to focus on this conclusion, just so we're all on the same page. Education is a goal, okay? Governments used to look at education, and until now, as a basic right, okay? It is one of the markers that ensures equity and equal opportunity. And so here's a problem. How can you ensure equity without education? It's basically one of the tenets of a fair and just society. So globalization, okay, competitiveness has eroded equity within the society through stratification. So this occurs and therefore spreads, and now it has become entrenched at lower grades, meaning that the social cohesion of the state is deeply threatened. And so societies right now become less concerned with education as a value, with the public good, so mean like what is good for the public, and more what's good for the market. Okay, so the state has now become too occupied with what's good for their pocket. So to end, on an end note, so everybody understands, is that globalization and ICT have changed the manner in which the state and the school creates educational policy. And so I will post my questions in the forum, and if anybody has any questions or concerns, please feel free to message me. We're all here to help each other understand what Carnoy is basically trying to tell us. And I really hope you enjoyed that, and I wish you all a very pleasant day.